Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Down Syndrome Center podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Kishore Velody, and today's podcast, we're going to be talking about some really important issues that impact really all of our families in one way or another. And with us is our transition clinic specialist. Many of you know Dr. Andy McCormick, who works with us here in the center as our transition specialist. So Andy is trained in both internal medicine and pediatrics. So he's specially equipped to work with these types of issues as we work on getting our teenagers ready for adult life in multiple different ways. We've had Andy on in the past talking about our transition clinic. I would encourage you to go listen back on that podcast to hear more about what we do in this clinic. But Andy, before we get too far into it, how about just tell our listeners a little bit about who you are, what you do, and why you love working with this population.
Yeah, so thanks, Kishore. Yeah, so I'm Andy McCormick. Like Kishore said, I am one of the faculty members in the Down Syndrome Center. I have a unique training in that I was trained both as an internal medicine doc, AKA big person doctor, and a pediatrician, so taking care of our kids. And so that uniquely kind of set me up to kind of sit in both worlds and kind of understand the cultural difference between those two worlds. And so transition really is a lot about how do you navigate that cultural change and what are the gaps that can occur in that process. And so, I think one of the things that I find so rewarding in my job, and being my job not just in the Down Syndrome Center, but my job as a physician in general, is kind of helping families make these navigations so there isn't a gap in their care that leads to something that can really alter the direction of their life. And that's really what our transition clinic is about. It's about building a bridge to make sure that our young adults and their families navigate the movement from a pediatric-oriented care to adult-oriented care.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Andy. And I think listeners who don't know, this transition program here at the Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh has really taken off, and it's become pretty world-renowned, in fact, in terms of what you're doing, Andy. So thank you for being a part of our center and joining us on this podcast. I think where I'd like to start, if we could, is just thinking about some of the legal issues. Now, we're both physicians, and so legal issues can sometimes feel a little bit out of our realm of expertise, but working in a transition clinic, of course, you've become quite familiar with a lot of these types of things that can come up. So I guess where I'd like to start is, tell me a little bit more about what it is to have power of attorney or guardianship. What's the difference between the two? Why would a family choose to have one or the other? Things like that.
So I'll start by saying, number one, I'm not a lawyer. So this is not direct legal advice. I will say one of the things that's really unique about our center, specifically our transition clinic, is we have a connection with the health law clinic at Pitt Law. And we actually have some of the legal law students who come and do brief evaluations with our families, and then can also help direct either to legal support or do sometimes pro bono work. And so we do a lot of these discussions in connection with legal support, because the big difference between these are kind of levels of support that young adults need as they move to the adult world. So just backing up a second, when we think about transition, we talk about healthcare transition, it's really important not to think about things in silos. So, I'm going to only think about medicine, right? And I'm going to make sure they get to the adult doctor and that their medical issues are addressed. But I forget about the other areas of their life. I really think of it as like pieces of a puzzle, that each domain of our life is connected. And so for me, thinking about kind of the legal implication of a young adult's life is paramount for how do we support their health. And it's really important because there's this really interesting thing that at 18 years of age, the government has decided that magically we become our own decision makers. Mm-hmm. There's like no test, there is no kind of guideline that says you have achieved a level of independence that you can be making your own decisions. It's merely an age limit. So at 18, what happens is it doesn't matter who you are in the eyes legally. That includes the government, that equals financial institutions, that includes healthcare institutions, all these things, you have become your own decision maker. And that's really important because that controls two things. It controls how information is shared, meaning that you get to decide who has access to your information. And by default, those institutions will only share information with you unless you have stated otherwise. And number two, I actually did number one. Number two is that you, by default, are the decision maker. And it doesn't matter if you are making what would be viewed as the right decision or a good decision. You are the decision maker. And so you have the opportunity to make that decision. People can't make that decision for you. And that's an important thing. So you can't have somebody who says, oh, this young adult is having a hard time making their decision, so I'm just going to make it for him. By the law, they are the decision maker. Not only can they make their own decision, but they're the only one that can make that decision for themselves. Now, that's the legal nature of it. The practical application of this is a lot more gray, right? It's not that you now walk into your pediatrician's office at 18 and all of a sudden they don't talk to you anymore as a parent, and that the access for your involvement in making decisions is completely cut off. But the legal implications are that it's there. So the default is the young adult is their own decision maker. We know that a lot of our young adults need some support in that decision making. And really there's two levels of support in general that are looked upon. And those categories are what we call power of attorney. And that's what we call really a shared decision maker model. And then what we call guardianship. And there's some other terms like conservatorship that we'll talk about that really mean that this young adult has been legally deemed unable to make their own decision, and someone has to be identified as their decision maker. So let's talk about each of those for just a second so we can understand it a little bit better. So power of attorney. This is actually a concept that we do all the time that we don't even think twice about. I'll give you a really practical example. When you go to a bank and you sign up for a bank account, you give that bank financial power of attorney over your money, because when you put it in the bank, they go and invest it and they're doing things with your money. And the only reason they can do that is because you've signed a document that they can be in your financial circle. So when you go to a bank and you sign up for a bank account, you're signing up for power of attorney with that bank. So that model means that you have to be able to make your own decisions and choose who you can legally identify as a supported decision maker. So for our young adults, what that means is that typically they will work with a lawyer, and I would recommend working with a lawyer. You can go on the internet and Google and print out a document, but you really do want it to be legally worded correctly, and it can vary a little bit from state to state. So I would recommend working with a lawyer. It usually costs around $100 to $150 for a lawyer to complete a power of attorney. And what they will do is they'll write up a document that helps you identify who is going to be your shared decision maker and for what things. So is it related to healthcare? Is it related to financial decisions? Is it related to other decisions? And what you have to do is the lawyer, after they write up this document, they have to talk to the young adult and say, do you give permission to your mom, your dad, whoever's on that document to be your shared decision maker? So that young adult has to have the capacity, the ability to make that decision. And when they do, that power of attorney has been established. What does a power of attorney actually do? It does not take any decision-making power away from the young adult. That young adult still has the ability to make all the decisions they want independently. It just brings people within the circle of decision-making. So information can be shared and decision-making can be shared when needed. But, this is important for people to understand, if that young adult at any time makes the decision that this power of attorney is no longer valid, it instantly stops because they have the capacity to make the power of attorney as well as disqualify it. So it's an important document. And what I typically tell families is if you have a young adult who currently is able to kind of make decisions and also know when they struggle with making decisions and will ask for help, that's a great model when power of attorney is helpful. So if you have a young adult who has the ability to make good, sound decisions in some spheres and knows when to have help and will ask for help, those are the young adults that power of attorney is great for. Power of attorney is a very quick process and financially, in the scheme of things, not very expensive.
So Andy, who determines whether that young adult is capable of making these types of decisions? Is that up to the parent? Is that up to the doctors?
It's actually up to the lawyer.
Okay.
So when they go in and they make that document, part of that process of asking those questions and notarizing the form is they're identifying that young adult is having capacity to make those decisions.
Okay.
And so they're kind of putting their name behind the fact that this young adult has capacity and that this is a legal document. So that's a great question.
Mm-hmm.
The second level is what we kind of put into the category of guardianship, conservatorship. And that is when a young adult is not able to make decisions independently, and they need somebody to make those decisions. This is a much more significant process because it actually is a legal process determined by the courts. So it's actually now a judge who determines capacity. And so the process usually is a couple $1,000s, and you have to meet with a lawyer. The lawyer usually gets basically evidence. So you meet with a doctor fills out a dissertation of what they think the young adult's capacity is. Multiple family members will go to the court. Sometimes the young adult is questioned by the judge, and they have a discussion about, is this young adult have the capacity? And what capacity is a legal distinction that a young adult can make decisions on their own. And to make decisions on your own, you have to understand kind of the information you're being asked, the implications of your decision, and then make a decision that is in alignment with kind of your goals, with who you are. And it's a judge determines that process. I will say one of the things I said in there is that the young adult may be asked to go before the judge. Often what will happen in these situations is the judge will ask me, do I think that discussion will be traumatizing or harmful? And I can write a letter that kind of takes the young adult out of that situation if that's the scenario. So that doesn't it probably happens 50% of the times. But if we think it's going to be harmful, and that's usually the parents bringing that up and then us having a discussion, then the young adult doesn't always have to be part of that process. Like I said, what are the negative things about this? Very expensive, usually multiple thousands of dollars. It's a legal process, so it doesn't happen overnight. You have to get a court date, you have to get the evidence, you go before a judge, and then he makes that documentation. And the last thing is it's very permanent. Power of attorney, right? I said a young adult can say, this no longer exists, it doesn't exist. When a court determines that someone doesn't have capacity, you then have to go back before a court and prove that they were wrong or something has changed, that this person now has capacity. And so it's a large step to back that off. So what I usually talk to families with is like, hey, how much decision making does your young adult have? How much do they rely on you for support? If we think that power of attorney is something they can navigate, I usually encourage families to go that direction, because you can always move from power of attorney to guardianship, but it's hard to go the other direction.
Okay.
Now, guardianship, just so you know, also isn't like you have no capacity, especially in Pennsylvania. Some states are different. You can have guardianship for certain domains of your life and power of attorney for others. So for instance, if we know that a young adult will not be able to make any decisions financially, that's actually known as conservatorship in some states. We don't have that in Pennsylvania, but you can have limited guardianship around financial needs. It can also be around healthcare decision-making. So you can have limited guardianship around healthcare needs. And so there is the ability in Pennsylvania to do those kind of certain domains of your life versus not needing different levels of support. I will say this is a very, very gray area though, because even across the state of Pennsylvania, it's a little bit dependent on judges about how lenient they are, because sometimes they don't like making decisions where they say you have capacity in some areas but not others, because that is a very difficult legal situation. So that's the big overview of those two topics. Really thinking about power of attorney, shared decision making, not super expensive, about $100 to $150. You should do it with a lawyer, and the young adults still can make their own decisions, but they are bringing people into their circle of decision making. Guardianship, the young adult doesn't have capacity. They can't make decisions on their own. It's an expensive process. It's a long process. And it's usually a permanent process. Both of those cannot start until you turn 18 years of age. So usually power of attorney, I usually say meet with a lawyer right around your 18th birthday, set it up. It can happen the same day. Guardianship, I usually tell families 6 months before your 18th birthday, you should meet with a lawyer and start the process of getting this information so you can get a court date somewhere in that kind of ballpark of 18, so that process can kind of happen and not have a lot of lag time.
So, Andy, this is something that you would definitely say a family should be thinking forward about as their child is getting into their later teenage years, because if they haven't had this done yet, and let's say the young adult is 19 and ends up going to the ER or something for a medical issue, legally that ER is obligated to then take that 19-year-old's wishes over even the parents' wishes. I know that may not always happen exactly like that, but legally that's how it's supposed to happen, right?
Yeah, it's definitely happened like that.
Okay.
And this is the scenario that's kind of the classic scenario, right? Usually when it's kind of your community, the people who know you, there's like this kind of understanding of how things work. But when you get outside of your community, so people who don't know you, then they have to be stricter. So a young adult has a car accident, goes to an ER, you call up the ER and say, I'm so-and-so's dad, I need to have this information. Where is my child? They don't have to, and I've had situations where they don't give you that information because they don't know for sure if who you are as a random person, and you don't have that kind of same legal support. Before 18, you're technically the guardian of your child, and so you're built into that framework. But after 18, that all disappears, and so you don't get to stay within that same kind of circle of information.
Andy, thanks so much. That's a lot of great information on power of attorney, guardianship, the pluses and the minuses of both of those things. I really appreciate you sharing that expertise with us. But I do feel like there's more that I'd like to talk with you about in terms of like the legal aspects of things as people start to transition into that adulthood. Would you be willing to come back and talk with us more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I would love to come back and talk to you about Social Security income, some of the kind of the requirements around that, and maybe even thinking a little bit about waivers.
That's fantastic. And I think hopefully our families are getting the sense of how important and how useful the transition clinic here at our Down Syndrome Center, and perhaps even where you are, would be to navigating a lot of these issues. I really appreciate the fact that we have that opportunity for our families to be able to transition this way. So we will look forward to having Dr. McCormick back on a future podcast to talk about some of these other issues. For those of you who are listening and wondering, boy, what else can we be possibly talking about on this podcast? Please do send us an email. You have some ideas that you want us to talk about or podcast topics you'd like us to really go into deeper detail. Just give us an email, downsyndromecenter@chp.edu. And then for those of you who would like to join with us in what we're doing here, including this podcast, please feel free to become a partner with us. You can go to givetochildrens.org/Down Syndrome Center, and you can become a partner with us. And we would love that and really appreciate it. So thank you all. And we will look forward to our next podcast with Dr. McCormick. Bye-bye.